The beacon came from nothing. No planet nearby, no station, no wreck large enough to show on long-range scans, just empty space between two dead star systems and one small signal pulsing out of the dark like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Ryland Cole was not in a good mood when the alert reached him. He had been elbow-deep in a coolant pipe on Deck 4, fixing something that 3 other engineers had already declared unfixable, and he had almost had it. Then his comm clicked, and Captain Bren's voice came through flat and calm the way it always did when something was actually wrong. "Cole, suit up. You're on the away team." The beacon turned out to be coming from an escape pod the size of a supply closet. It was tumbling slowly, one thruster burned out, hull scorched on the port side like something very hot had passed very close to it not long ago. The ISV Coldwell matched its spin and pulled it in with a tow clamp, and Rylan was standing in the cargo bay when the outer doors sealed and the pressure equalized. Nessa Ford, the ship's medic, stood beside him with a scanner already running. She was young, calm in the way that people who have seen bad things get calm, and she did not say anything as the pod's emergency latch released with a pop of stale air. Inside, under a silver thermal blanket, something moved. Ryland stepped forward before he thought about it. He pulled the blanket back. It was a dragon. A very small dragon, maybe the length of his forearm, scales the color of deep ocean water, blue-green and faintly iridescent, catching the cargo bay light like the inside of a shell. It had 4 limbs, a tail longer than its body, and 2 wings folded tight against its back. Its eyes were silver. They were open. They were looking directly at Rylan. Neither of them moved. Then the dragon made a sound, not a roar, not a hiss, something between a chirp and a low hum, the kind of sound a very small creature makes when it is trying very hard not to show that it is scared. It pressed itself flat against the back of the pod. "Velhari," Nessa said quietly, reading her scanner. "This is a Velhari hatchling, Rylan. The species registry has them listed as," she paused, "as extinct." "Apparently not," he said. He reached into the pod slowly, not grabbing, just putting his hand there, palm up, the way you approach anything frightened and small. The dragon stared at his hand for a long moment. Then it leaned forward and sniffed his fingers. Then it grabbed his wrist with both front claws and held on. It did not let go. Ryland stood there with a baby dragon gripping his arm and looked at Nessa, and Nessa looked back at him. And for a moment, neither of them knew what to do, which was not a feeling either of them was used to. "Med Bay," she said finally, "I need to run proper scans. It needs warmth and food and probably water." Ryland said, without knowing why. Nessa raised an eyebrow. Ryland said again, "Not it." He carried the dragon to the med bay with the creature still wrapped around his forearm, claws, gentle silver eyes watching everything. The corridor lights made his scales shift color slightly as they moved, blue deepening to green and back again. A couple of crew members stopped and stared. One of them started to say something and then just did not. In the med bay, the dragon finally let go of Ryland's arm long enough for Nessa to run her scans. He sat on the exam table and allowed it, watching Ryland the entire time. When Ryland took one step toward the door, the dragon made that sound again, the frightened chirp, and Ryland stopped. He leaned against the wall instead, crossed his arms, stayed. The scan results were not complicated. The hatchling was malnourished, slightly dehydrated, and running a low fever. He was approximately 4 years old in Velhari terms. He was the only living Velhari on record anywhere. Ryland filed his discovery report that evening, logged the beacon coordinates, and listed the pod contents as one survivor, species Velhari, designation unknown, conditions stable. He did not list him as cargo. He went to check on him before lights out. The dragon was curled in the corner of the med bay cot Nessa had padded with blankets, tail wrapped around himself, eyes half closed. A small blue-green scale had come loose and was sitting on the white fabric beside him, first shed, no bigger than Ryland's thumbnail. Ryland picked it up without thinking, looked at it, put it in his jacket pocket, and forgot about it. He turned off the light and went to bed. The dragons slept. Neither of them knew yet what had just been set in motion. 7 days passed the way good days do, quietly, without announcing themselves, so that you only notice them when they are gone. Sorro learned 5 words in that time. Nobody taught him. He simply listened, the way very young creatures do, absorbing everything with those wide silver eyes. And one morning he looked up at Nessa when she set down his food bowl and said, clear as anything, food. She stood there for a full 3 seconds before she called Rylan on the comm and made him come hear it himself. After that it went quickly. Stay, wait, no, which he used mostly when Rylan tried to leave a room, and Rylan, which he said constantly, at all hours, in the particular tone of someone who has found a thing they intend to keep. The crew fell for him completely. There was no resisting it. He was small and bright-colored and curious about everything, and he had a habit of sitting very still on a person's shoulder while they worked, watching what their hands were doing with deep concentration, like he was taking notes. Chief Engineer Polar said he was the best assistant she'd ever had. She meant it. Rylan maintained that he was simply keeping an eye on the creature for medical and security reasons. He said this while Sorro sat on his boot during a briefing. He said it while sharing his evening meal with a dragon who kept stealing pieces of food off his tray and looking extremely innocent about it. Nobody argued with him. They had all quietly agreed to let him have his story. Then the transmission came. Rylan was in the corridor outside the command deck when he overheard the tail end of it, Councillor Orin's voice coming through the speaker, thin and precise, with the particular flatness of someone who has never once said a thing they did not mean to say. Under Article 9, Clause 4 of the Sovereignty Human Accord, the Velhari hatchling is classified as cultural heritage property of the defunct Velhari civilization, now held in custodianship by the Sovereignty Council. Transfer is not a request. We will rendezvous at Council Station Marin in 3 standard days. Please have the artifact prepared. Rylan stood very still in the corridor. Artifact. He went to find Admiral Duna. She was at her desk, and she had the look she got when she already knew what someone was about to say and had already had the argument with herself and lost. She let him sit. She let him talk. She listened to all of it, the full case, the word artifact, the thing Sorro said when Rylan left a room. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Then, the treaty is binding, Cole. A legal challenge could take years. Decades, maybe. The Council has controlled Velhari classification records since before you were born. He's not a record, he's alive. I know that too. Her voice did not change. That was the worst part. Prepare the handover, 3 days. He read the Council archive files that night on his datapad, sitting on the edge of his bunk. What he found inside them was clean and cold and thorough. Sovereignty cultural preservation vaults were climate-controlled, structurally sound, and completely empty of anything living. No interaction protocols, no enrichment schedules, just storage. Whatever went in stayed in, preserved and silent, until the Council decided otherwise, which, for species classified as extinct, was never. Nessa knocked on his door after midnight. She had been crying, which she did not acknowledge. She sat down on the chair across from him and said, "There has to be something." "I'm looking," he said. Sorro had followed Nessa down the corridor and now sat in the doorway, watching both of them. He did not come inside. He just sat there with his tail curled around his feet and his silver eyes moving from one face to the other, reading something in the room that he did not have words for yet. After a while, he padded across the floor and climbed up beside Rylan and pressed his side against Rylan's arm. He was warm. His scales had a faint vibration when he was calm, like a very quiet engine running deep inside him. Rylan put the datapad down. He did not sleep much, but he stayed where he was, and Sorro stayed with him, and outside the porthole the stars moved slowly past, and 3 days felt both very long and very short at the same time, which is what 3 days feels like when you are running out of them. In the morning, Rylan started reading treaty law. He was not trained for it, he read it anyway. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from pushing against something that does not push back. It simply holds a wall, a system, a document stamped in triplicate by people who are long dead. Ryland spent 2 days inside that exhaustion. He contacted the ship's xenolegal officer first, a quiet man named Dort who had spent 30 years filing compliance reports and had the look of someone who had seen every version of a lost cause. Dort listened, pulled up the relevant treaty clauses on his screen, and then very carefully told Rylan that Article 9 had no sentience threshold written into it. The Council had not needed one. They had simply classified the Velhari as pre-sapient in their own records, and the treaty had accepted those records without question, because at the time nobody had thought to check. But the records could be wrong, Rylan said. They could be, Dort agreed. Proving it through official channels takes 18 months minimum, assuming a cooperative review board. The Council appoints the review board. Rylan went deeper. He pulled everything the ship's database held on the Velhari, history, biology, what little linguistics existed. What he found made him sit back in his chair. There were 6 papers written by a Velhari language researcher, published 40 years ago, describing structured syntax in Velhari vocalizations, complex grammar, a tense system, evidence, careful and sourced, of sapient communication. The papers had been quietly de-indexed from the Sovereignty Academic Registry 11 months after publication. He took this to Admiral Duna. She read everything he put in front of her. She read it thoroughly, which was somehow worse than if she had dismissed it quickly. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "This is real," she said. "Yes, and suppressed." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "If we present this as grounds to delay transfer, the Council will call it a procedural challenge to the Accord itself. They will have legal standing to classify the Coldwell as non-compliant. We lose our docking rights at 4 stations. Trade restrictions follow, depending on how far they want to push it." She did not finish the sentence. Rylan said, "Is there anything we can do?" Duna looked at him for a long time. "Not that I can authorize." The pause after that sentence lasted about 3 seconds. It was the most important 3 seconds of the conversation. He left her office and went back to the main corridor and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, thinking. Sorro found him there. He always found Rylan when Rylan went still, as if stillness was a signal the dragon was tuned to. He came padding down the corridor with his tail held low and sat down directly on Rylan's boot, which was a habit he had developed in the first week and never stopped. Rylan looked down at him. Sorro looked up. "Hey," Rylan said. "Rylan," Sorro said. They stayed like that for a while. Later in the cargo bay, Rylan was checking the handover inventory, a meaningless task that someone had to do and he had volunteered for so he could be alone. Sorro had followed him, as he always did, and was sitting on a supply crate nearby, watching. He had been quieter today, not frightened, not exactly, something more careful than that, like he was paying very close attention to everything. Rylan was writing something on his datapad when he heard a small sound and looked up. Sorro had opened a tiny pouch near his left wing joint. Rylan had noticed it before, a natural fold in the skin, small and neat, like a pocket. He had not known what it was for. Now Sorro had 2 claws inside it and was very carefully looking at whatever was in there. His silver eyes were serious. His head was tilted slightly. Then he closed it. He looked at Rylan. "Rylan," he said, then very carefully, the word he had been practicing the past 2 days, the one Nessa said he kept repeating in the med bay at odd hours. "Stay." Rylan's jaw tightened. He made himself hold the dragon's gaze. "I'm working on it," he said. Sorro kept looking at him. He did not say anything else. He did not have the words for what he seemed to understand, but he understood it anyway, the way very young things understand things, not through language, but through something older. He turned and looked at the cargo bay door, then back at Rylan. Rylan went back to his datapad. He was not working on inventory anymore. He was drafting a legal brief, badly, without training, citing the 6 suppressed papers and the 3-second pause in Admiral Duna's office and every other thin thread he had found. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. He wrote it anyway. 1 day left. The countdown was a physical thing now, something he could feel in his chest when he breathed. 1 day left, and Rylan Cole, who was not a lawyer and not a diplomat, and not the kind of man who had ever once believed paperwork could save anything, kept writing. The Sovereignty ship had no windows. That was the first thing Rylan noticed when it docked. Every human vessel had windows, ports, portholes, observation panels, something. Light got in. The outside world got in. The Sovereignty ship was a perfect white rectangle with sealed hull plating from bow to stern, and it attached to the Coldwell's docking ring like something that had never needed to see out. Councillor Orrin came through the airlock with 2 officers in matching grey and a containment unit on a gravity sled. The unit was white, featureless, about the size of a large storage trunk. There were no labels on it, no handle, no window. Orrin was polite. That was somehow the hardest part. He shook Admiral Duna's hand, acknowledged Captain Bren, nodded briefly at Rylan, and then asked, in the tone of a man completing a purchase, whether the Velhari hatchling was ready for transfer. Yes, Duna said. Rylan had not spoken yet. He was standing to the left of the docking bay entrance, and when he turned to walk back into the ship to get Sorro, the corridor was full. Nobody had been ordered there. There was no formation, no ceremony. The crew had simply come, Polar from engineering, Dort from Xenolegal, 6 others, standing quietly along the walls, facing the bay. Nessa was at the front, and her eyes were red, but her face was steady, and she gave Rylan one small nod when he looked at her. He went to get Sorro. The dragon was in the med bay, sitting on the cot. He had known something was different since morning. He had been very still all day, not exploring, not sitting on anyone's shoulder, not stealing food, just watching. When Rylan came in, Sorro looked at him for a long moment, and then he stood up and walked to the edge of the cot and waited to be picked up. Rylan picked him up. Sorro settled against his chest, one clawed hand gripping the front of Rylan's uniform, and did not make a sound. They walked back through the corridor, past Polar, who looked at the floor, past Dort, whose expression did not change but whose hands were clasped very tight in front of him, past 6 other crew members who had nothing to say and said nothing and were there anyway, which was the only thing left to be. Into the docking bay. Orrin looked at Sorro with the mild interest of a man reviewing documents. Specimen appears healthy, he said, and reached for the containment unit's panel. His name, Rylan said, is Sorro. Orrin looked at him. We don't assign personal designations to archived cultural heritage. Rylan said nothing else. He walked to the containment unit and knelt on the bay floor so that he and Sorro were at the same height. He set the dragon down gently in front of the open unit. It was warm inside. He could feel that much, and lit with a soft white light, and it was the emptiest thing Rylan had ever seen. He looked at Sorro. Sorro looked at him. I'll find a way, Rylan said. His voice was steady. He did not know if he believed the words. He said them anyway. I promise. Sorro put both small clawed hands on Rylan's face, not gripping, just resting there. His silver eyes moved slowly over Rylan's features the way they had done on that first day in the cargo bay, taking careful note of everything, storing it. He stayed like that for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he did something small and quick. His right hand moved to the tiny pouch near his wing, opened it, took something out, and slipped it into the breast pocket of Rylan's uniform. The motion was so smooth, so quietly deliberate, that it was barely a movement at all. Then Sorro turned around. He walked into the containment unit on his own 4 feet. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He walked in and sat down in the center of the white space and curled his tail around himself and did not look back. The panel sealed with a soft click. Orrin said something about documentation. Rylan did not hear it. He was looking at the white cube on the gravity sled, which now looked like every other sealed container he had ever seen in his career, and was not. The sovereignty officers moved the unit back through the airlock. Orin followed, the docking ring disengaged. The crew stood in the empty bay. Nobody said anything for a long time. Nessa pressed her hand flat against the sealed airlock door for a moment, then let it drop. Polar turned and walked back into the ship. The others followed, slowly, in ones and twos. Ryland stood there after they had all gone. His hand moved to his breast pocket. He felt something small inside it, flat and smooth and no bigger than a thumbnail. He did not take it out, not yet. He stood in the empty bay and breathed, and through the narrow gap between the hull panels, the sovereignty ship pulled away into the dark and was gone. The ship felt wrong that night. Not loud, not broken, just wrong, the way a room feels when something that used to be in it is not anymore, and the air has not caught up to that fact yet. The corridors were the same corridors. The lights were the same lights. But there was no small set of claws on the floor, no low hum from the med bay, no sound of a creature saying a name it had decided was the most important word it knew. Ryland sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time doing nothing. Then he reached into his breast pocket. The scale was small, blue-green, iridescent, catching the light the way Sorro's whole body had caught the light shifting color when you moved it, like it couldn't commit to just one thing. It was no bigger than his thumbnail. The edges were smooth. It was the first scale Sorro had ever shed, the one that had come loose on that first night in the med bay and landed on the white cot fabric, and Ryland had picked it up without thinking and put it in his pocket and forgotten it was there. He had forgotten it completely. But Sorro had not. Sorro had watched him pick it up, had, at some point in the weeks that followed, taken it back, had kept it in that small wing pouch in the only private space he had, and today, in the last moment before a door sealed behind him forever, he had given it back. Ryland sat with the scale in his open palm for a very long time. He was not a man who cried easily or often. He did not cry now. What happened was quieter than that. Something in the center of his chest came loose, and the grief moved through him like something very large passing through a very small space, and when it was done, he was still sitting there, and the scale was still in his hand, and the anger that came after the grief was clean and cold and completely without confusion. He set the scale on the desk in front of him. Then he opened his datapad. The legal brief he had started the previous day was still there, half-finished, badly structured, citing sources in the wrong format, and missing 3 key procedural steps he did not know the names for. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened a new document beside it and started a message. He sent the brief to every xenolegal channel in the human fleet database. He sent it to 2 university research departments that had published adjacent work on sovereignty classification law. He sent it to a journalist at the Outer Systems Press who had broken 3 suppression stories in the past decade and whose contact information Ryland had held for 2 years without ever using it. He sent it to the Office of the Human Sovereignty Liaison, knowing it would land in an inbox that nobody checked, and sent it anyway. Then he wrote one message to Admiral Duna. It was short. It said, "You told me there was nothing you could authorize. I am not asking for authorization." Her reply came 3 minutes and 40 seconds later. It was not a reprimand. It was not approval either. It was a single attached file containing one contact code, the personal channel of a woman named Advocate Rhys Solon, who held the senior xenolegal chair at the Human Galactic Law Institute and who had 30 years ago successfully argued the first non-human sapience recognition case before the Sovereignty Council. The case had taken 4 years. She had won it. Ryland stared at the code for a moment. Then he copied it and started composing. He wrote to Rhys Solon for an hour, laying out everything: the suppressed papers, the falsified classification records, the timeline of the Velhari extinction, and the Council's convenient custody claim, and Sorro himself. What he said, what he understood, what he had done in a cargo bay on a quiet morning when he thought nobody was watching him look at something small and important in his wing pouch. He wrote all of it plainly, without decoration, and at the end he described the scale and what it meant, and why he was writing at midnight with no legal credentials and no institutional backing and no plan except this one. He scented. Then he sat back. The scale sat on the desk in front of him, blue-green and small, and the room was very quiet. He did not move it. He did not put it away. He left it exactly where he could see it, which was where it was going to stay. He pulled the datapad back and started reading treaty law again, not looking for a gap this time, looking for a door. There was a difference, and he had only just learned it. Somewhere on a white ship with no windows, a small creature sat in a white room and waited. Ryland did not know if Sorro was frightened or sleeping or pressing his nose against the sealed wall and listening for something on the other side. He chose to believe he was listening. He kept reading. 14 months is not a long time in galactic law. It is a very long time when you are waiting. Ryland was reassigned twice in the first 6 weeks, once to a survey posting at the edge of human space, and once to a logistics role on a station so far out that the comm lag made real-time conversation with anyone he cared about almost impossible. He understood what was happening. He completed his duties. He kept writing. The demotion came in month 4. Formal grounds were listed as unauthorized public communication with non-human press organizations. He accepted it without appealing. He had known it was coming. The article in the Outer Systems Press had run 2 days after he sent the file, and it had been picked up by 6 other outlets within the week, and the story of a baby dragon who walked into a white box on his own so that the humans he had chosen would not be punished for fighting to keep him. That story did not stay quiet. It traveled the way true things travel, without anyone pushing it. Nessa testified before the Sovereignty Council's Ethics Board in month 7. She had prepared a formal statement. She set it aside when she sat down and spoke without notes instead. She talked about the morning Sorro had learned to say her name, getting it slightly wrong at first, something closer to nay, and then correcting himself 3 hours later with the careful precision of someone who took accuracy seriously. She talked about the way he watched hands when people worked, storing information for later. She talked about the wing pouch and what had been inside it, and what it meant that he had chosen, at the last possible moment, to give it back. The chamber was quiet when she finished. Councillor Oren, who was present, did not speak. The 6 suppressed papers were formally re-indexed in month 9. 3 new linguistic studies, built on the original work, were published in the same month. The lead researcher, a woman who had spent 20 years working in archived Velhari vocalizations without institutional support, gave a press interview in which she said she had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. The right question, she explained, was not, can they make sounds, but are the sounds language? She answered it in 412 pages. Rhys Solon, the advocate Duna's contact code had reached, was 71 years old and had not taken a case in 6 years. She read Ryland's message twice, called him on a channel that cost more per minute than his monthly pay, spoke to him for 9 minutes, and then filed a formal sentience reclassification petition the next morning. She did it, she told him, because the brief he had sent her was the worst structured legal argument she had ever read, and she had spent 30 years watching well-structured legal arguments lose to bureaucratic delay, and she thought it was time to try something that was simply true. The hearing was in month 13. Ryland was called to testify last. He had notes. He did not use them. He stood at the speaking platform in front of the council's full review board, and he held up the scale. It was still blue-green, still no bigger than a thumbnail. He had carried it every day for 13 months. It had been in his pocket on the survey posting and on the logistics station and at the demotion hearing and every quiet night in between. He said a child knew he was being taken away forever. He had one thing, the only thing anyone had ever given him, and he gave it back to me so I wouldn't forget him. You call that a relic. I call that a person saying goodbye. He put the scale back in his pocket and sat down. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Velhari hatchlings were reclassified as sapient persons under sovereignty law, effective immediately. The classification change applied retroactively to all archived Velhari individuals. There was one, his name was Sorro. He was to be released from cultural archive custody and placed under provisional human guardianship pending permanent arrangement. The Caldwell was given the retrieval assignment. Rylan stood in the cargo bay when the containment unit came through the airlock on its gravity sled. The same white cube, the same sealed panel, no labels, no window. It had been 14 months. He did not know what was inside it now, in any sense that mattered. He did not know what 14 months of silence did to something that had been frightened and young and full of words it was just beginning to learn. The panel opened. Sorro stepped out. He was bigger, not much, but some. His scales had deepened in color, more green now than blue, with a new copper edge that caught the light at certain angles. He stood in the entrance of the unit and looked at the cargo bay for a moment, at the ceiling, at the floor, at Pola, who was standing against the wall with her hand pressed to her mouth. Then he looked at Rylan. Rylan could not speak. Sorro stepped forward. He stopped in front of Rylan and looked up at him for a moment, very serious, the way he had always gone serious when something was important. Then he said, slowly and clearly, two new words he had somehow learned or kept or made from nothing in a white room with no windows. "You stayed." Rylan reached into his pocket. He put the scale into Sorro's outstretched hand. Sorro closed his fist around it and held on and did not let go. Outside the porthole, the stars moved past the same as always, distant and cold, and completely indifferent to what happened in the small warm spaces between them. That was fine. The small warm spaces did not need the stars to notice. They kept going anyway. They always had. That was the whole point.